Today is the day of the KMBest Holiday Block Party. This is my own tournament. Let's take a look at some of the stats and the coolest decks from this tournament and see if any of them are gonna be able to take it all the way. Starting with some card and deck stats, Shadow King, 37 of the 83 players in this tournament are bringing Shadow King. 26 of them are bringing Deafening Chord. Those are definitely the defining cards of this tournament metagame. That is important for understanding what the rest of these decks are doing. This is a pretty interesting restriction to put on the metagame. It's very similar to what it looks like in real life. I expected a lot of things to look fairly similar to a ladder metagame, but there were a couple of really notable and interesting changes that happened in terms of archetype representation due to the tournament format and also the way in which we set up the rules. Remember, you have to be running a card from the last 3 months and you cannot be playing Aurora. So how did that impact these brackets? Out of the 83 players, 1 player brought Destroy and 1 player brought Bounce. Other archetypes that are represented in the bracket are C3 Thanos, Man-Spider Combo, Ongoing Combo without Living Tribunal, and Pixie. So there's quite a diverse array of decks that you're going to see, despite the fact that it seems pretty clear that the dominant archetypes are sort of Shadow King-y with V-Hand or with Werewolf, whatever, Deafening Chord-y with V-Hand or with Werewolf, whatever. Various forms of that do seem to be the most commonly played archetypes, but that hasn't destroyed diversity. One of the interesting things about the restrictions we put on this format is that I think they probably hit combo decks a little bit harder than they hit mid-range decks, because combo decks have very specific pieces, and those are likely to be the kind of things that if your specific piece of a combo deck doesn't necessarily fit into the rule set, then you might not be able to play that combo deck, which has led to this. In terms of unrepresented archetypes, Hela, Apoc Discard, Clog, and Living Tribunal are nowhere to be found in the bracket, which I think I would consider an absolute win. If you told me that there was going to be a tournament and there would be no Hela, no Aurora, no Apoc Discard, no Clog, I would say you probably have a very interesting and watchable tournament. I didn't expect the rule set to work out this way, and I'm unsure exactly who to chalk it up to. Is this just, this is the people who watch me in this tournament, and so they've inherited my distaste for this stuff? Or is this actually something where the rule set is impacting deck selection? Either way, I'm very happy as someone who is going to be broadcasting this that we get a lot of what seem to be more intricate, small ball, involved Marvel Snap games, and a lot less of these decks that tend to functionally create non-games. So what are some of the best players in this bracket bringing? We're going to start with Safety Blade, who's basically been like a kid in a candy store with Aurora. This is a card that is aimed squarely at him. When I saw this deck, I looked at the cheapest card in it and the most expensive card in it and actually started laughing. Safety Blade has been a bit of an echo truther for a very long time, and Aurora finally giving him a genuine excuse to play the card as a one-cost card that isn't ongoing is just something that I saw and I was immediately like, I know exactly why this deck is the way that it is. Now, what this deck is trying to do is do a combination of 2 different end games and hope that the rest of the deck can hold up. It has devoted a large amount of its slots, Aurora, Juggernaut, Cosmo, to end game type stuff. Those are very often cards you're playing on the final turn of the game. Another notable thing here is a Copycat instead of a ramp card, which would be either a Luna Snow or a Superior Spider-Man. Luna Snow, obviously a little bit better for what your Aurora is trying to do, but a little bit worse in the context of you being a Stardust deck, and Superior Spider-Man doesn't work with Aurora at all. So where exactly is this deck going? I think what this deck is trying to do is be a tech deck that isn't a tech deck. There's really only one tech card in here in the sense that Cosmo is kind of just sort of a catch-all, Juggernaut is kind of just sort of a catch-all. The tech card here is Stardust, which is covering things like Nimrod and Hela, which actually aren't very represented in the bracket. There are, if I recall correctly, about 4 or 5 Nimrod-type decks, and only 0, of course, Helas. So the Stardust looks like a really interesting choice in that light, which means he's going to have to get a lot of value out of locations that Stardust makes good. This is a really interesting thing to try. I am looking forward to seeing how this deck manages to perform in a world where its main targets really aren't here. Stardust is not going to be doing much in this bracket. So how strong is Aurora going to be able to be in a world where the rest of the deck is just okay? Smiz has brought a nightmare list, which I think is a pretty clever thing to do. With Aurora being taken out of the bracket, there's a big question as to what the best thing to do when you want to surprise your opponent for a lot of cubes is, and I think Nightmare's a pretty good argument. My gut check is that Nightmare, which is being brought by both Smiz and Denish, although they brought two different lists, which I think is really cool, is a very solid way to achieve cube equity in a format where the biggest free roll cube equity guy, Aurora, is not allowed. That's a really powerful thing in a format that is also rewarding people for winning big. And I think that that is sort of the aim of this kind of deck right now. Now, to me, the Nightmare list has pretty conclusively proven to be a little bit worse than the normal ramp list. So I am interested to see if that inconsistency that's introduced here, when I play this deck, a lot of it feels like, oh, okay, I'm playing this Nightmare card, I'm putting Nightmare into this, and it's like, oh, well, sometimes on turn 3, I'd just rather play my ramp game plan anyway, because if I do the Nightmare stuff, I won't get to play the Blink on turn 4, right? I don't want to give up my ability to do Electro Blink, so when am I actually playing the Nightmare? And I think that comes out a lot. Like, the contextual ability that you're going to need to understand when you're a Nightmare deck and when you're not a Nightmare deck is, I think, actually a pretty skill-testing part of the way this deck plays out, and it'll be especially interesting in a format like this, with cubes being at such a premium. I think you could argue the format for this tournament is the most Snap skill intensive Marvel Snap tournament of all time. That is kind of a real thing that could be a major factor in how this deck plays out. Denish has taken a Nightmare deck that I think is a lot more straightforward in terms of mostly always wanting to be a Nightmare deck. This is a deck that is all about the card Nightmare and doing things with the card Nightmare that are generally unfair. Full stat allocation here, just big numbers and surprise effects. Of the two Nightmare decks, this is the one that I like the most because it is more about the card Nightmare, which allows you to access more of that cube equity side of the deck that I think is really important. I'm interested to see how this deck ends up playing out. I think that it's notable Denish didn't bring Hela. I wonder how much of that is just because of the deck building restriction, but I'm glad he didn't because I think this deck is a bit of a sleeper in this bracket. It should come as no surprise to see really good players taking mid-range decks, but I am surprised to see Sizer made the exact choices that he made here. I realize that the effective power of this deck is basically that it is a zombie deck that doesn't have the weakness to Shadow King built in, where instead of having the top end being Zombie Giant Man with Zombie Scarlet Witch, which is much more synergistic with what this deck is actually trying to do, your top end ends up being Annihilus and, of course, Sentry. That's fine. Like, this, playing zombieless zombies to dodge a format full of Shadow King decks makes perfect sense to me. That's a normal thing to do. What I'm surprised by is the Quake inclusion, which I think in an open decklist environment, you can probably find a better 2-3 to play. I think Quake is really cool when your opponent doesn't know you have it, but maybe I'm underrating just the threat of a Quake in terms of how people are going to have to play. I can definitely see Quake being a major player, but I can't imagine it's better in this format than it is on ladder, and I definitely can imagine that it's worse. I think that this is a solid mid-rangey choice. Like, this is a very reasonable Shadow King Deafening Chord deck, and Sizer is, of course, a great player, so I wouldn't be surprised to see him in the top 8 or even winning the entire thing. But I am a little surprised at the Quake. I do kind of think that there's probably a better option here. I do like the Iron Patriot, of course. Anything that adds some kind of equity in terms of your opponent not knowing what the hell you're doing in an open decklist format is very, very valuable. I just wonder if maybe that Quake is supposed to be a Valentina or something. Like, I really do wonder about that because of the way open decklists tend to function. I can see a card like Valentina gaining a lot of equity and a card like Quake losing a lot of equity. But between Cable and Iron Patriot and Merlin, this deck does have a non-zero amount of hidden information that can allow you to leverage the fact that everyone knows what everyone else is doing pretty reasonably. Husky Puppies brought a different Aurora list. This is one of the ones he's been working on for a while. It is a pure stats Aurora deck that is just looking to Aurora every single game, maybe twice if possible. The numbers here are interesting. I think the premise of this deck, if you're Husky, is you're going to say, I'm going to get to combo level output with a deck that not a lot of people are prepared to beat, and I'm going to do that without priority on turn 6 to dodge all the Shadow King. But when I look at the format and I look at 37 Shadow Kings and I look at 26 Deafening Chords and I look at this deck and I look at the amount of cards that say activate on them and I look at the amount of cards that are adding green power to the board, I do worry that this one is going to be in a bit of an awkward position. So the reason it's on here is because I think it's a fascinating Aurora build that not a lot of people are really understanding. Most people who are playing Aurora decks are doing the Safety Blade type thing of using her as your top end for mid-range slush pile that is just a mid-range slush pile with cards that have nothing to do with each other. Aurora is basically saying your mid-range slush pile is now actually also a deck that has synergy because she explicitly is a synergy card for decks that don't have synergy. That means that this kind of Aurora deck has largely fallen under the radar. The kind of Aurora deck that is really built around her and not built around what she lets you do. That's what I'm interested to see in this bracket. Is Husky Puppies, an extremely good player, going to be able to take a deck that I think is pretty poorly positioned and really prove to us that Aurora needs to be respected outside of mid-range slush piles? Halo Effect is a really good player, and I think it's pretty clear when I said there was one bounce deck in the format that we were going to talk about it. Bounce is a deck that I have always considered pretty fascinating. When you think back to 2023, Bounce being one of the best decks, a lot of that was down to the fact that Bounce was bigger than every mid-range pile, and mid-range piles were so incredibly dominant. Bounce was able to simply have more points than the other things that people were playing. It was, in effect, the combo deck of the format. That's what Bounce was. You couldn't interact with it. It was playing a role that is similar to a role that Hela plays, that Nimrod plays. It says my numbers are bigger and I get to distribute them in a way that is up to me, and you don't really have any way to interact with them profitably for various reasons, right? Nimrod, of course, you can't really like destroy the Nimrod for, duh. You would have like Stardust now, you have like Juggernaut, the lane that the stuff is in, but like you see what I'm talking about, right? This is a deck that got rid of your opponent's ability to interact with it via the power of priority, meaning they just wouldn't be able to do anything to your cards because they're all face down until they all flip face up, and then you win the game because you have more points than them. Bounce, as the smallest combo deck, has been in an awkward position ever since they effectively made combo decks legal again by nerfing all the tech cards. When the tech cards got nerfed, I won't say we went into a combo meta, but it's definitely more of one, right? And when there are decks that are doing a bunch of stats, the smallest combo deck is the biggest victim, because this deck is going to lose to every other combo deck. Every deck that is going to be able to do more stats than this. If this deck plays against the Nimrod deck and the Nimrod deck does its combo, I don't think you can possibly beat it. But what's interesting about this in this format is, as we discussed, there's actually kind of not a lot of combo. There's no Hela. There's not really any of like the Living Tribunal stuff. Those are two matchups you look at and you're like, I am instantly dead in. There's only a couple of small ongoing combos. There's a couple of Nimrod combos. So the real question for this deck is it able to have bigger stats than Werewolf Midrange and V-Hand? Because I think if it is, this could be a pretty good field for a bounce deck. Gamer is, of course, playing the most gamer deck of all time, a Supergiant list that is, I think, I've talked a lot about how mid-range hasn't really worked in tournaments. Supergiant is kind of the only, I guess you'd call it, mid-range deck that has. This is a deck that is so different from other sort of baseline interactive mid-range decks in the ways that it plays out, in the permutations of final turns that it has, that it so often feels like it's just in every single game. And I really want to see how well this one can do. Gamer is, of course, an undisputed master of this archetype, top 4 in the most recent Golden Gauntlet with this deck. This is an extremely powerful archetype in the right hands, but I don't know that anyone other than Gamer is the right hands for this list. So I'm really interested to see how this one plays out, because the interactive power here is really interesting. This deck is doing more weird stuff than basically anyone else. I also really want to shout out to for Cable, who is really showing up in a couple of reasonable decks. It's good for Cable that he got that extra point of power. He is now one of the better 2s in the game, especially in a deck like this that cares deeply about points on the board to manipulate priority by the time Supergiant comes down on turn 4. Either way, I'm really excited to see what this deck is able to do. I do worry that it might not have enough beef in it. When you really look at what this deck is doing, it's leaning pretty hard on having half of a clog deck in it. And by half of a clog deck, I really just mean it has Goblin Titania. This is the closest deck to clog in the bracket, by the way. It's this, and there's like an Agamotto deck with a Viper in it. That's kind of it. And so I think that this is a really interesting space for a deck to exist in. And I really, really want to see how this one plays out. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. And if you want to check out the tournament, it'll be live streamed on my Twitch channel. We'll be giving away packs bundles during the run of the tournament. Make sure you check it out. As always, I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal. Remember to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.